James Calloway stared at the two white horses through a veil of sweat and regret, the scars of war on his soul matching the raw wounds on their broken bodies. Standing in the harsh Nevada dust with empty pockets and a foreclosure notice in his truck, he never imagined that saving these wild creatures would be the key to saving himself. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun beat down on James Calloway's weathered face as he stood at the edge of the corral, his eyes fixed on the two white horses that stared back at him with equal intensity. The dust swirled around his boots, kicked up by the desert wind that never seemed to rest in this corner of Nevada. 10 years in Afghanistan couldn't prepare him for the battle he'd fought to save these two magnificent creatures. A battle that had cost him nearly everything. 3 months earlier, James had been driving his old pickup along the foothills of the Ruby Mountains when he spotted them. Two white Mustangs, separated from their herd, trapped in a narrow canyon. Their coats, once pristine, were caked with dirt and blood. One was limping badly, its front leg caught in what looked like an illegal trap. The other refused to leave its side, circling protectively, despite its own emaciated condition. Should have just called the BLM and kept driving, James muttered to himself, adjusting his hat to block the sun. But he knew he couldn't have done that. Not with what he'd seen in those horses' eyes. Something about their silent suffering had struck a chord deep within him. After returning from his third tour, James had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. The nightmares, the isolation, the pills the VA kept prescribing, none of it helped with the hollowness he felt inside. But in those desperate horses he'd recognized something familiar, survivors fighting against impossible odds. James had approached them slowly, speaking in low, even tones. The injured mare had reared up, terrified, while the stallion positioned himself between James and his companion. "Easy now," James had whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you." It had taken hours of patience, sitting perfectly still in the canyon, just talking. The sun had set and risen again before the stallion finally allowed James close enough to see the severity of the mare's wound. The trap had cut deep into her leg, and infection had set in. Without intervention, she would die. "That's when I made the decision," James told Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who now stood beside him at the corral. "I knew if I left them there, that mare wouldn't make it another day." Sarah nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "And that's when you brought them here to your ranch?" James laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. Ranch is a generous word for what this was back then. 20 acres of dust and scrubland with a falling-down cabin my grandfather left me. I hadn't even been living in it. Was staying in a motel outside Carson City. What he didn't tell her was that he'd spent the last of his savings to transform the property. The cabin had been uninhabitable, so he'd slept in his truck for weeks, while building the corral and a makeshift shelter for the injured horses. He'd maxed out his credit cards purchasing medical supplies and feed. When that ran out, he'd sold his truck, then his grandfather's antique firearms collection, and finally his Purple Heart and the watch his father had given him before he died. The stallion had been easier to work with. Once he understood James wasn't a threat, he'd allowed himself to be led into the trailer James had borrowed from a reluctant neighbor. The mare had been another story. Too weak to stand, she'd collapsed during the rescue. James had to improvise a sling from old canvas and ropes to get her loaded. "Those first nights I didn't sleep," James continued, his voice low. "Sat up with the mare, cleaning her wound, giving her antibiotics I'd gotten from the farm supply store. The stallion wouldn't leave her side, wouldn't eat unless I brought food to him where he could see her." Sarah's expression softened. "You saved their lives, James. Not many would have gone to such lengths for wild horses." James shrugged off the compliment. He couldn't explain that saving these horses had saved him too. That having something to care for, something that needed him completely, had pulled him out of the darkness that had been consuming him since his discharge. His neighbor, Bill Rawlins, had been the first to notice the change. Bill had stopped by 6 weeks after the rescue, curious about the commotion he'd heard. He'd found James hammering together a proper stable, covered in sweat and sawdust but clear-eyed for the first time in years. "You look different," Bill had said, helping James lift a heavy beam. "Like you've come back to life." James had just nodded. How could he explain that these horses understood him in a way no human could? They knew trauma. They knew survival. They didn't ask questions about what he'd seen or done, didn't expect him to be the person he was before the war. As the weeks passed, the mare's condition improved. The deep gash in her leg began to heal, though Sarah warned it would always leave a scar and a slight limp. The stallion grew more confident, less defensive, and James found himself talking to them, really talking, telling them stories he hadn't been able to share with his therapist or the support group at the VA. "I think they're ready for the next step," Sarah said, interrupting James's thoughts. "The mare's leg is as good as it's going to get, and they're both putting on weight nicely." James nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "That's good news." But it wasn't, not really. The next step meant releasing them back to the wild. That had been the plan all along. Rescue them, heal them, set them free. It was the right thing to do. Wild horses belonged in the open plains, not confined to his small ranch. Yet the thought of watching them disappear over the horizon made his chest ache in a way he couldn't articulate. "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitating. "The BLM has been asking questions. Someone reported you for keeping wild horses without proper authorization." James cursed under his breath. He'd known this was coming. The Bureau of Land Management controlled all wild horses in the region, and without permits, what he'd done was technically illegal. "They're sending someone out next week. You could face fines, James, significant ones." He nodded, his jaw tight. Money was something he no longer had. His bank account was empty, his credit destroyed. The few possessions he'd once valued were long gone, traded for hay and medicine and building materials. If they levied fines, he'd lose the land, the only thing he had left. "I don't regret it," he said quietly, watching as the stallion approached the fence, eyeing them with intelligent wariness. "Not for a second." Sarah touched his arm lightly. "I know, and I'll do everything I can to help your case, but James, you have to prepare yourself for the possibility they'll take the horses." James didn't respond. The mare had joined her companion at the fence, her injured leg bearing weight, but still favoring it slightly. They stood together, these two survivors, watching him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "We'll figure something out," he finally said. But as the words left his mouth, he wondered who he was trying to convince, Sarah or himself. The day the BLM officials arrived, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. James had spent the morning mucking out stalls and reinforcing the corral fence, trying to make the place look as presentable as possible. Not that it would matter. The issue wasn't the condition of his facilities, but his lack of permits and proper authorization. He'd just finished filling the water troughs when a government-issued SUV pulled up, kicking dust into the air. Two people emerged, a tall man in a pressed uniform and a younger woman with a tablet and a camera slung around her neck. "Mr. Calloway?" The man extended his hand. "Thomas Riker, Bureau of Land Management. This is my colleague, Melissa Diaz. We're here about the Mustangs." James wiped his palm on his jeans before shaking Riker's hand. "Been expecting you." Melissa was already taking photos of the corral and the horses. The stallion had positioned himself in front of the mare, his ears pinned back in suspicion of the newcomers. "That's quite a protective stance," Riker observed, watching the stallion. "How long have you had them?" 3 months, James replied. Found them in bad shape up in Ruby Canyon. The mare had her leg caught in a trap. Riker nodded, making notes. And you're aware that removing wild horses from public lands without authorization is prohibited under federal law? I know the law, James said quietly. I also know that Mare would have died if I'd left her there. There are proper channels, Mr. Calloway. You could have contacted our office or a wild horse advocacy group. James felt a flash of anger but suppressed it. Out there with no cell service, bleeding animal, and the nearest town 2 hours away? Sometimes you don't have the luxury of proper channels. Melissa had moved closer to the corral, her camera forgotten as she studied the horses. They're in remarkable condition considering what you described, she said. Especially the mare's leg. I can see the scar from here, but she's bearing weight on it. James has done exceptional work with them, came Sarah's voice from behind. James turned to see the veterinarian approaching from her truck. She'd promised to be here for the inspection, and he'd never been more grateful for an ally. Introductions were made, and Sarah provided her professional assessment of the horse's health and the care they'd received. James watched Riker's expression carefully, but the man's face remained impassive as he continued taking notes. May I see your facilities? Riker asked. James led them around the property, the corral, the small stable he'd built, the storage shed where he kept feed and medical supplies. Everywhere they looked, evidence of his desperate sacrifice was visible. The stable was constructed from mismatched lumber, some of it salvaged from the collapsing parts of the cabin. The medical supplies were organized in repurposed containers. Everything spoke of resourcefulness born of necessity. And you've been living here while caring for them? Melissa asked, glancing at the cabin, which was still only partially habitable. James nodded. Slept in my truck at first, been fixing up one room at a time. You must really care about these horses, she said softly. Before James could respond, Riker cleared his throat. Mr. Calloway, I need to be direct with you. Regardless of your intentions, you've violated federal regulations. These horses legally belong to the American public and are under BLM management. I understand that, James said, jaw tight. Our standard procedure would be to impound the animals and issue a citation, which, given the circumstances, could result in fines up to $10,000. The amount hit James like a physical blow. Even if he sold the land, he wouldn't be able to cover that. However, Riker continued, there may be alternatives we can discuss. Hope flickered briefly in James's chest, but he kept his face neutral, waiting. Sarah stepped forward. If I may, I've been documenting James's work with these horses. The rehabilitation techniques he's using with the mare, in particular, are quite remarkable. His military experience with trauma seems to have given him a unique approach that's yielding impressive results. Riker raised an eyebrow. How so? The mare's physical recovery is one thing, but these horses were severely traumatized. Wild horses that have experienced what these two have typically remained skittish, sometimes permanently. But look at them now. They all turned toward the corral. The stallion had relaxed somewhat, though he still watched them warily. The mare had moved to the edge of the fence and was observing them with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. They trust him, Sarah continued. In a remarkably short time, he's gained their confidence without breaking their spirit. That's rare. James shifted uncomfortably under the praise. He wasn't used to anyone speaking about him this way. Melissa had been taking notes throughout Sarah's explanation. Mr. Riker, this might align with the special studies program we discussed last month, the one about trauma recovery in wild mustangs. Riker considered this, then turned to James. Do you have military experience with animals, Mr. Calloway? I worked with the K-9 units in Afghanistan, James replied. Explosive detection mostly. Helped rehabilitate some of the dogs after incidents. He didn't elaborate on what types of incidents, The IEDs, the firefights, the chaos that had traumatized both humans and animals alike. "And you've applied those techniques here?" James shrugged. "Not consciously. I just understand them, I guess. What they've been through." A look passed between Riker and Melissa that James couldn't interpret. Then Riker sighed and closed his notebook. "Here's what I'm proposing, Mr. Calloway. We have a new program studying rehabilitation methods for traumatized wild horses. Typically, we contract with established equine therapists and ranches with all the proper facilities." "Which I don't have," James pointed out. "No, you don't. But what you do have is a unique approach and clear results. Ms. Diaz and I need to discuss this further with our supervisors, but I'm considering recommending you for a special provisional permit." James blinked in surprise. "What would that mean exactly?" "It would allow you to legally keep these horses while working with our research team. You'd receive some funding for proper facilities and care in exchange for documenting your methods and results." "Like a study?" James asked, skeptical. "Like a partnership," Melissa suggested. "Your techniques could potentially help other traumatized wild horses throughout the program." James looked out at the two horses who had come to mean everything to him. The stallion had relaxed his guard slightly, allowing the mare to move forward. She was watching James intently, as if she understood that her future was being decided. "They'd stay here? With me?" James asked, his voice betraying more emotion than he intended. "Provisionally, yes," Riker replied. "There would be regular inspections, documentation requirements, and you'd need to make some improvements to your facilities, but they'd remain in your care." The relief that flooded through James was so intense it made his knees weak. He turned away briefly, not wanting the others to see the moisture that had suddenly appeared in his eyes. "I'd be agreeable to those terms," he finally managed, his voice steady once more. As Riker and Melissa prepared to leave, promising to be in touch within the week, the storm clouds that had been gathering finally released their burden. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steadier, a blessing in the parched Nevada landscape. James stood in the rain, watching as the two white horses raised their heads to the sky, seeming to welcome the water that darkened their coats, but could never diminish their luminous presence in his life. The promised week stretched into 2, then 3. Each morning, James checked his email at the public library in town, but there was nothing from the BLM. As days passed without word, his optimism began to fade. Perhaps Riker's offer had been empty kindness, or worse, had been overruled by higher authorities. James threw himself into work around the property, channeling his anxiety into physical labor. He reinforced the corral fencing, repaired the leaking roof on the stable, and continued rehabilitating the cabin. The horses seemed to sense his unease. The stallion, whom James had begun calling Ghost for his ability to move silently despite his size, watched him constantly with intelligent eyes. The mare, now named Willow for her surprising resilience, began to follow James around the corral, limping slightly but gaining confidence each day. "You two are the only ones who don't judge me," James told them one evening as he brushed Willow's coat. Ghost stood nearby, his ears pricked forward at James's voice. "Everyone else looks at me and sees damage. My therapist at the VA, the guys at the support group, even old Bill down the road. They're all waiting for me to crack." Willow leaned into the brushstrokes, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Maybe they're right to worry," he continued softly. "Before you two came along, I wasn't in a good place. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't see a future worth sticking around for." Ghost snorted softly and moved closer, nudging James's shoulder. The gesture was so unexpected that James laughed, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. "Yeah, I know. You've got your own problems. That trap didn't just wound Willow's leg, it hurt both of you, made you distrust everything human. James had been making progress with their training, though he was careful not to approach it as breaking their spirits. His goal wasn't to domesticate them, but to help them overcome their trauma so they could eventually return to their natural habitat healthy and whole. At least, that had been the plan until the BLM visit. Now he dared to hope they might stay. On the first day of the 4th week, James arrived at the library to find an email from Melissa Diaz. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Mr. Calloway," it read, "I'm pleased to inform you that our team has approved a provisional permit for the Wild Horse Trauma Recovery Study Program. You and your Mustangs have been selected as our first case study. I'll be arriving next Tuesday to set up monitoring equipment and discuss the details of the program. Thomas Riker sends his regards." James read the email 3 times to make sure he'd understood correctly. Relief washed over him in waves so powerful he had to grip the edge of the desk. They were staying. His horses were staying. He rushed back to the ranch, eager to share the news even though he knew the horses wouldn't understand his words. Yet when he arrived, he found a sheriff's vehicle parked in his driveway. Sheriff Ellis Parker was leaning against his cruiser, his expression grim. "James," he greeted with a nod, "got a complaint I need to discuss with you." James's stomach tightened. "What kind of complaint?" "Water rights. Bill Rawlins says you've been diverting more than your share from the creek that runs between your properties. Says his cattle are suffering because of it." James clenched his jaw. The accusation was absurd. The creek was barely a trickle these days due to the drought, and he'd been careful about his usage. "That's not true, Sheriff. I've been hauling water from town for the horses. Haven't touched the creek in weeks." Ellis sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "I believe you, son, but Bill's got friends on the county board. He's filing formal complaints, and there'll be an investigation." "Why now?" James asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Word gets around. People heard the BLM was here. Bill's been trying to buy your grandfather's land for years. If he can make things difficult enough for you, I might be persuaded to sell," James finished bitterly. Ellis nodded. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Bill's playing hardball this time." After the sheriff left, James sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands. One crisis averted, another arriving on its heels. The land dispute with Rawlins wasn't new. The older man had been pressuring James's grandfather to sell for decades. But now that James had something worth fighting for, the stakes felt infinitely higher. Inside the corral, Ghost and Willow watched him with what seemed like concern. James forced himself to his feet and approached them. "Don't worry," he told them, though the reassurance was as much for himself as for them. "I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on this place." By the time Tuesday arrived, James had prepared for Melissa's visit by clearing out a corner of the cabin to serve as an office space. He'd scrounged an old desk from the town's second-hand store and set up the ancient desktop computer he used for ranch accounts. Melissa arrived promptly at 9, her SUV loaded with equipment. "This is quite a change from when we were last here," she remarked, noticing the improvements James had made to the property. "Been busy," James replied, helping her unload boxes of camera gear, sensors, and a new laptop. "I can see that." She smiled. The program provided a budget for facility improvements, but it looks like you've already tackled most of the urgent needs. As they set up monitoring equipment around the corral, Melissa explained the parameters of the study. "We're focusing on 3 key areas: physical rehabilitation, psychological recovery, and social reintegration. Your case is particularly interesting because you're working with a bonded pair who experienced trauma together." James watched as she installed weather-sealed cameras at strategic points around the corral. "What exactly are you hoping to learn?" Traditional methods of rehabilitating wild horses often involve breaking their spirit to make them manageable. But that approach is increasingly seen as counterproductive, especially for horses that will eventually be released back into the wild. She paused, studying him. Your approach seems different. Less domination, more partnership. James shrugged. In Afghanistan, I saw what happened when we tried to force people to change. Didn't work so well. He hadn't meant to draw the parallel so explicitly, and he fell silent, embarrassed by the admission. But Melissa nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of insight we're interested in, the intersection of your military experience with trauma recovery techniques. They worked through the morning, installing equipment and establishing a documentation protocol. James would record daily observations in a journal and weekly video updates. The cameras would provide continuous monitoring of the horse's behavior. There's one more thing, Melissa said as they finished lunch, sandwiches she'd brought from town. The program includes a stipend for your work as a research partner. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a check that made James's eyes widen. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover his immediate expenses and begin proper repairs on the cabin. This is more than I expected, he admitted. It's fair compensation for your expertise, Melissa replied. Plus, there's additional funding allocated for feed, medical care, and facility improvements. As she prepared to leave, they stood at the corral watching Ghost and Willow. The horses had remained wary of Melissa throughout the day, but their trust in James was evident in the way they consistently returned to him, seeking reassurance amid the changes. They really do trust you, Melissa observed. James nodded, a hint of pride warming his chest. We understand each other. That's what makes this study so valuable, she said. You're not just rehabilitating their bodies, you're healing their spirits. After Melissa departed, James remained at the fence, watching his horses as the sunset painted the Nevada landscape in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a path forward that held meaning. We're going to be okay, he told Ghost and Willow, who had come to stand before him, their white coats glowing in the fading light. All of us. The research program brought unexpected structure to James's days. Each morning began with observations, noting the horse's physical conditions and behaviors in the journal Melissa had provided. Afternoons were dedicated to rehabilitation exercises for Willow's leg, and evenings to socialization, simply being with the horses, letting them grow accustomed to human presence without demands. As weeks passed, James found himself healing alongside his charges. The nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan became less frequent. He still had bad days, moments when a sudden sound would send him diving for cover, or when memories would grip him so tightly he couldn't breathe. But they were increasingly outnumbered by good ones. Today was a milestone. James stood in the center of the corral, a rope halter dangling from his hand. After months of patience, he was attempting Willow's first formal halter training. Ghost watched warily from the corner, his posture tense. Easy now, James murmured. Nobody's going to hurt either of you. Willow approached cautiously, her injured leg much improved, but still bearing the visible scar of her trauma. James remained still, letting her investigate the halter, sniffing it and nudging it with her nose. When she didn't retreat, he slowly raised it toward her head. The mare flinched, stepping backward. James immediately lowered the halter. That's okay, he said softly. We've got time. He noticed Ghost pacing nervously. The stallion's protective instincts were strong, and seeing Willow in a potentially vulnerable position clearly distressed him. James made a mental note to include this observation in his report. The bond between the two horses was a crucial element of the study, how trauma experienced together affected rehabilitation. After another 20 minutes of patient work, Willow finally allowed James to slip the halter over her nose. He didn't tighten it or attach a lead rope. Today was just about accepting the sensation. When he removed it 5 minutes later, rewarding her with gentle words and a handful of oats, he felt a surge of pride that nearly brought tears to his eyes. "You did good, girl. Real good." As he exited the corral, he spotted a dust cloud in the distance, a vehicle approaching along the dirt road. His momentary contentment evaporated as he recognized Bill Rawlins's truck. The older man pulled up aggressively, braking hard enough to send gravel spraying. He climbed out, his weathered face set in familiar lines of displeasure. "Calloway," he greeted curtly. "Heard you got yourself some government funding." James crossed his arms. "What can I do for you, Bill?" "You can explain why you're wasting taxpayer money on wild horses that should have been rounded up and processed like all the rest." Rawlins spat on the ground. "BLM's gone soft, letting bleeding hearts like you interfere with proper land management." "Is there a point to this visit?" James asked, struggling to keep his tone even. Confrontation made his pulse quicken, triggered hypervigilance that belonged in combat zones, not rural Nevada. "Point is, this little project of yours won't last. Government funding dries up, programs get canceled, and when it does, my offer to buy this worthless patch of dirt still stands." Rawlins gestured around dismissively. "Though price keeps dropping, the more you let this place go to hell." James felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, the precursor to the rage that had gotten him into trouble more than once since returning home. He took a deliberate breath, using the grounding techniques his VA counselor had taught him. "I appreciate the offer," he said with forced calm, "but I'm not selling." Rawlins's eyes narrowed. "Water board meetings next week. Might want to reconsider before things get complicated for you." After Rawlins departed, James walked to the water trough and plunged his hands into the cool liquid, focusing on the sensation to calm his racing thoughts. When he looked up, both horses were watching him intently from the fence line as if they had sensed his distress. "It's okay," he told them, though the tension in his voice betrayed the lie. That evening, James emailed Melissa about the day's progress with Willow. He didn't mention Rawlins's visit. That was a personal problem not related to the study, but as he typed his report, he found himself including more personal observations than usual. "Willow's acceptance of the halter seems connected to her growing trust," he wrote. "It's not just about the physical recovery of her leg, but about healing the invisible wounds, the fear, the wariness. I recognize it because I'm going through something similar. Some days it's harder than others to believe that the world isn't just waiting to hurt you again." He paused, then deleted the last 2 sentences. The report was supposed to be about the horses, not him. But the parallel was undeniable. Their journey mirrored his own. The following week brought Sarah for her monthly veterinary checkup. As she examined Willow's leg, her expression grew increasingly impressed. "The muscle tone is remarkable," she said, running her hands along the scarred limb. "She's bearing almost full weight now. Whatever exercises you've been doing, they're working beautifully." James nodded, watching as Willow stood calmly for the examination. "We've been doing gradual hill work. There's a gentle slope behind the stable where we walk each day. Builds strength without too much strain." Sarah moved on to examine Ghost, who tolerated her touch with visible restraint. "And this one," she said with a smile, "still the protector but much calmer than before." After completing her examination, Sarah joined James on the porch. "The footage from the study is generating quite a buzz in veterinary circles," she told him. "Melissa's shared some clips with colleagues, and your methods are raising eyebrows, in a good way." James shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not doing anything special." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah countered. "Traditional rehabilitation focuses almost exclusively on physical recovery. Your approach integrates emotional healing. The way you respect their wild nature while building trust, it's unusual." She hesitated, then added, "The BLM is considering expanding the study. There's a herd about 60 miles north where several horses were injured during a roundup. They're thinking about bringing a few here under your care." James stared at her. "More horses? I don't have the facilities for that. They'd provide funding for expansion. It could become a proper rehabilitation center, James, something permanent thing." The possibility hung in the air between them. A future James hadn't dared imagine. Not just a temporary reprieve for Ghost and Willow, but a real purpose, a way to use his broken pieces to help heal others. Later that night, unable to sleep, James sat on his porch watching the horses in the moonlight. They moved like silver shadows across the corral, occasionally nickering softly to each other. The thought of more horses coming, of expanding the program, filled him with both excitement and dread. Could he handle it? The responsibility of more traumatized animals looking to him for healing? And what about Rawlins and the water rights dispute? If that escalated, it could threaten everything he was building here. Ghost approached the fence, watching James with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses. The stallion had come so far, from aggressive protectiveness to a calmer, more measured vigilance. Still wild at heart, but learning to trust again. "What do you think, boy?" James asked softly. "Should we make room for more like you?" The stallion shook his magnificent head, his white mane catching the moonlight. It wasn't an answer, of course, but to James it felt like one nonetheless. He would build something here, something meaningful. Not just for Ghost and Willow, not just for himself, but for all the broken souls who needed a second chance. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since leaving the battlefield, James felt ready to face the fight. The county water board meeting was held in a stuffy room at the back of the town hall. James sat uncomfortably on a metal folding chair, acutely aware of the stares directed his way. In a community where most families had lived for generations, he remained an outsider, his grandfather's grandson, but not truly one of them. Bill Rawlins sat across the aisle, flanked by two other ranchers. The older man's confident posture suggested he expected a favorable outcome. When James's name was called to address the board regarding the water dispute, his mouth went dry. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, even before Afghanistan left him hypervigilant in crowds. "Mr. Calloway, you're accused of excessive water diversion from the shared creek that runs between your property and Mr. Rawlins's land. How do you respond?" James rose slowly, focusing on keeping his breathing steady. "The accusation is false. Due to the drought, I've been hauling water from town for the horses' needs. I've installed rain catchment systems and storage tanks to minimize my impact on the watershed." A board member shuffled through some papers. "Mr. Rawlins has submitted documentation showing significantly reduced water levels on his portion of the creek. That's because his cattle have unlimited access to the water source," James responded, surprising himself with his steady voice. "I've installed controlled access points on my section to prevent erosion and contamination. Scientific studies show this actually improves downstream water quality and quantity." He pulled out a folder containing the research he'd compiled with Sarah and Melissa's help, studies on riparian management, before and after photos of his water conservation efforts, and detailed logs of his water usage. As the board members reviewed his documentation, Rawlins shifted in his seat, his confident expression faltering. James continued, "I've implemented every recommended conservation measure. Mr. Rawlins's cattle, on the other hand, have free rein to trample the banks and contaminate the water." By the time the meeting ended, the board had declined to take action on Rawlins's complaint and instead recommended that both property owners implement approved conservation measures. It wasn't a complete victory, but James had held his ground. As people filed out of the meeting room, Melissa approached with a smile. "That went well. I didn't know you'd be here." "Figured I might need moral support," James admitted. "Thanks for the research assistance. Happy to help. Actually, I was planning to come see you tomorrow. The BLM has made a decision about expanding the program." James tensed. "And?" "It's approved. 3 more horses will be arriving next week, all Mustangs injured during roundups. The expansion budget has been approved too, including for additional corrals and a proper stable." James felt a mixture of elation and anxiety. This was what he wanted, a chance to build something permanent, to help more horses like Ghost and Willow. But expansion meant more visibility, more scrutiny, more people coming and going on his property. It meant pushing further out of the protective isolation he'd wrapped around himself since returning from war. "That's good news," he managed, though his expression must have betrayed his conflicting emotions. Melissa studied him with understanding. "It's a lot, I know, but you won't be doing it alone. The program includes funding for part-time assistants. Sarah recommended her veterinary intern, Amy Chen. She's finishing her degree and needs practical experience with large animals." James nodded, processing this new information. Help would be welcome, especially as the program grew. But the thought of another person on his property daily, invading the carefully constructed sanctuary he'd built, made his chest tighten. When would she start? She could begin this weekend, helping prepare for the new arrivals. The contractors for the additional facilities will arrive Monday. The speed of it all made James's head spin. 3 months ago, he'd been living in limbo, barely existing from day to day. Now his life was accelerating in directions he hadn't anticipated. That evening, as dusk settled over the ranch, James sat with Ghost and Willow, sharing his thoughts as had become his habit. They listened with pricked ears, occasionally nudging him for attention. "It's going to get busy around here," he told them. "New horses coming, construction, a veterinary intern." He stroked Willow's nose. "You two will need to set a good example. Show the newcomers that humans aren't all bad." Ghost snorted as if in response, making James smile. The stallion had developed distinct personalities around different humans, still wary around strangers, tolerant of Sarah, subtly hostile toward Melissa with her cameras and equipment, but increasingly affectionate with James. 3 days later, Amy Chen arrived with a battered pickup truck and a no-nonsense attitude that took James by surprise. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her mid-20s, with short-cropped hair and a direct gaze that didn't waver when they shook hands. "Dr. Chen said you're doing groundbreaking work with trauma recovery," she stated without preamble. "I've read the preliminary reports. Your approach contradicts most traditional training methods." James wasn't sure if she was criticizing or complimenting him. "I just do what works for these particular horses." "That's exactly what's interesting," Amy replied. "Individualized care rather than standardized protocols." She gestured toward the corral. "Mind if I observe them? I won't interfere." James led her to the fence, where Ghost immediately positioned himself between the newcomer and Willow. "That's their normal response to strangers," James explained. "Ghost is extremely protective." Amy nodded, her eyes tracking the stallion's body language. "Hypervigilance, classic trauma response, similar to what we see in abused domestic animals and humans with PTSD." James glanced at her sharply, but her focus remained on the horses. There was no pity or assumption in her observation, just clinical interest. "How long before they accept a new person?" she asked. "Depends on the horse and the person. Willow adjusts faster if Ghost does first. He's the barometer." James watched as Ghost paced along the fence line, keeping Amy in his sights. "He might take weeks to trust you, or he might surprise us." Amy remained silent for several minutes, simply watching. Then she said quietly, "They're beautiful, not just physically, their spirit." Even after everything they've been through, they haven't surrendered their essential nature. Something in her words resonated with James. It was exactly what he'd tried to preserve in his rehabilitation work, helping the horses heal without breaking their wild spirit. The contractors arrived Monday morning as promised, breaking the ranch's customary quiet with the sounds of vehicles, voices, and construction equipment. James had prepared Ghost and Willow as best he could, spending extra time with them the previous day, but the activity still agitated them. Ghost paced nervously, while Willow retreated to the far corner of the corral. Amy observed their distress with concern. Could we move them temporarily? Maybe to the back pasture while the heavy construction is happening near the corral. James considered this. He'd been slowly working with Willow on halter training, but Ghost remained resistant to any restraint. Moving them would be challenging. "We'd need to go slowly," he said. "Willow might follow a lead rope now, but Ghost would need to be free to follow her at his own pace." "Let's try it," Amy suggested. It would be a good test of their trust and healthier than leaving them stressed by the construction. Moving traumatized wild horses was never simple, but the construction noise left them little choice. James approached the task methodically, the way he'd been taught to handle high-stress operations in the military. "We'll use the connection between them to our advantage," he explained to Amy as they prepared. "Willow trusts me enough now to follow with minimal guidance. If she goes, Ghost will follow her, not me." Amy nodded, taking mental notes. "So we're using their bond rather than trying to control both horses directly." "Exactly. Direct control would just trigger their trauma responses." James collected a lead rope and the halter that Willow had grown accustomed to. "Stay back until we're underway. Any new element could disrupt the process." James entered the corral with deliberate, unhurried movements. Ghost immediately positioned himself between James and Willow, but without the aggressive posturing of months past. Progress, James noted mentally. The stallion's protective instinct remained strong, but the trust they'd built had tempered his fear response. "Hey there," James spoke in the low, steady voice he always used with the horses. "We're going somewhere quieter today." He approached Willow first, allowing her to sniff the halter, before gently slipping it over her nose. Ghost watched intently, but didn't interfere. When James attached the lead rope, Willow tensed momentarily, then relaxed as he stroked her neck. "That's it, girl. Nothing to worry about." The real test came when James led Willow toward the gate. Ghost followed at a careful distance, his ears forward, body alert but not panicked. Amy stood completely still as James guided Willow through the gate and onto the path leading to the back pasture. For a moment, Ghost hesitated at the threshold, visibly torn between the security of familiar territory and his instinct to stay with Willow. James held his breath. If Ghost bolted now, all their progress could be undone. Willow turned her head, nickering softly to her companion. It was all the encouragement Ghost needed. He stepped through the gate, maintaining his distance from James and Amy, but keeping pace with Willow. "That's remarkable," Amy whispered as they slowly made their way toward the pasture. The communication between them and their willingness to leave a secure environment. James nodded, focusing on maintaining a steady pace and calm demeanor, despite his own tension. Trust is a fragile thing. Takes forever to build, seconds to destroy. The back pasture was smaller than the main corral, but featured a gentle slope and natural shelter from a stand of cottonwood trees. James had prepared it with fresh water and hay, hoping the familiar scents would ease the transition. When they arrived, he removed Willow's halter immediately, allowing both horses the freedom to explore their new surroundings. Ghost approached the water first, testing it with cautious sips before drinking deeply. Willow followed, her gait smoother now than when James had first found her. Watching them move together in the morning light, their white coats gleaming against the green pasture, James felt a swell of pride so intense it caught him off guard. They've come so far, Amy said, standing beside him at the fence. James nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. Still have a long way to go. Don't we all? She replied softly. They spent the morning observing how the horses adapted to their new environment, Amy taking notes on their behavior patterns, while James focused on subtle signs of stress that might require intervention. By midday, both horses had relaxed considerably, grazing together near the cottonwoods. I need to check on the construction, James said eventually. Will you stay with them a while longer? Amy agreed, settling herself on a boulder with her notebook. As James walked away, he glanced back to see Ghost watching him intently, tracking his movement. Not with fear, but with something that looked remarkably like concern. The construction site was a hive of activity. The contractors were laying foundations for additional corrals and a larger stable with proper medical facilities. Melissa stood amid the chaos, consulting blueprints with the foreman. James, perfect timing, she called when she spotted him. We need your input on the stable layout. For the next hour, James reviewed plans and made suggestions based on his experience with Ghost and Willow. The stable needed to balance security with the horses' need for space and visual contact with each other. Trauma made isolation unbearable for them, another parallel James recognized all too well. The new horses arrive tomorrow, Melissa reminded him as they finished. Are you ready? James hesitated. As ready as I can be. What do we know about them? Melissa consulted her tablet. 2 mares and a young stallion, all injured during BLM roundups in the Painted Rock area. The younger mare has a respiratory infection from dust inhalation. The older one suffered a shoulder injury when she panicked in the holding pen. The stallion has lacerations along his flank from barbed wire. Physical wounds and invisible trauma, James thought. Like every soldier he'd ever served with. Like himself. We'll need to keep them separated from Ghost and Willow initially, he said. New horses will disrupt the hierarchy they've established. Melissa nodded. That's why we're rushing the additional corrals. For now, the transport team will place them in the temporary holding area we've set up on the east side. When James returned to the back pasture, he found Amy sitting cross-legged on the ground, while Willow grazed barely 10 feet away. Close enough to observe but maintaining a respectful distance. Ghost stood watch from slightly further back. She approached me, Amy explained, when she saw his surprised expression. I didn't move toward her. James lowered himself to the ground beside Amy, careful to make no sudden movements. That's significant. She's never approached anyone but me voluntarily. They sat in companionable silence, watching as Willow gradually moved closer, her curiosity apparently overriding her caution. Ghost remained vigilant, but didn't intervene. I've been studying your journals, Amy said eventually. Your observation about mirroring their energy, matching their emotional state before trying to shift it, it's fascinating. It's like emotional resonance as a therapeutic technique. James shrugged, uncomfortable with the academic framing of what had been pure instinct on his part. Just seemed natural. Can't expect them to calm down if I'm projecting tension. It's more profound than you realize, Amy insisted. In traditional training, we impose our will on the animal. Your approach acknowledges their emotional reality first, then guides rather than forces. As if illustrating her point, Willow took another step closer, stretching her neck to sniff at James's outstretched palm. The trust in that simple gesture spoke volumes about how far they'd come. That evening, after returning Ghost and Willow to the main corral for the night, James and Amy sat on the porch reviewing preparations for the new arrivals. The construction crew had departed, leaving blessed quiet in their wake. Are you nervous? Amy asked, nursing a cup of coffee. About tomorrow? James considered the question. Not nervous exactly, but the new horses. There'll be different challenges, different traumas. You handled Ghost and Willow remarkably well, she pointed out, and now you have help. James glanced at her, appreciating her directness. There was no pity in her gaze, no careful tiptoeing around his own obvious damage, just practical recognition of the task ahead. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. The next morning dawned clear and cool. James rose before sunrise, checking and rechecking the temporary holding area for the new arrivals. Amy joined him, bringing coffee and a quiet determination that steadied his nerves. "Transport's on schedule," she reported after checking her phone. "Should be here within the hour." James nodded, his focus shifting to Ghost and Willow. They seemed to sense the impending change, moving restlessly around their corral, Ghost occasionally lifting his head to scent the air. "I've been thinking," James said, "about names for the new horses." Amy raised an eyebrow. "I thought you didn't believe in naming wild horses." "I didn't." Ghost and Willow named themselves in a way. James watched as the stallion paced along the fence line. But names help us connect, and connection is the first step toward healing. The BLM transport arrived precisely on schedule. A large trailer pulled by a government truck, dust billowing behind it as it made its way up the ranch road. James and Amy stood waiting, maintaining a deliberate calm, despite the tension humming between them. In the main corral, Ghost and Willow had gone completely still, their attention fixed on the approaching vehicle. "They sense it," Amy murmured. "New horses mean new dynamics." James nodded, his jaw tight. "Stay alert when they unload. Newly captured Mustangs are unpredictable, especially when injured." The truck pulled to a stop near the temporary holding area. Two BLM handlers emerged from the cab, followed by Melissa from her car behind them. After brief introductions, the senior handler, Mike, outlined the situation. "We've sedated them lightly for transport, but they'll be coming out of it soon." The young stallion's the most aggressive, tried to charge the capture team even with his injuries. James understood the impulse. Fear and pain made any living creature dangerous, whether horse or human. "Let's get them settled," he said, moving toward the trailer. The unloading process was tense but controlled. The older mare came first, a dun-colored horse with a distinctive scar across her shoulder where she'd crashed into a holding pen. She moved with stiff reluctance, eyes rolling to show the whites, a sign of extreme stress. "Easy," James murmured as the handlers guided her into the first section of the holding area. "You're safe now." Next came the younger mare, a sorrel with labored breathing that confirmed the reported respiratory infection. Despite her condition, she moved with nervous energy, startling at every sound. The young stallion was last, a bay with a proud carriage despite the bloodied bandages on his flank. Unlike the mares, who had shown fear and confusion, this horse projected pure defiance. He exited the trailer at a near charge, forcing the handlers to scramble. Once the new arrivals were secured in their separate sections, the transport team departed, leaving James, Amy, and Melissa to observe the horses as they oriented themselves to their new environment. "What do you think?" Melissa asked, tablet ready to record James's initial assessment. James studied each horse carefully before responding. "The older mare, I'm calling her Sage, she's carrying herself to protect that injured shoulder. The younger one, Ember, her breathing's worse than your report indicated. That needs immediate attention." Amy was already examining Ember from outside the fence. "Possible pneumonia. We should start antibiotics today." James nodded in agreement before turning his attention to the young stallion. "And this one?" He paused, watching as the bay paced aggressively along the fence line, stopping occasionally to challenge them with a direct stare. "Rebel," James decided. "He's not just scared, he's angry. That's going to complicate his rehabilitation." "Anger's a natural response to trauma," Amy noted quietly. in horses and people. James glanced at her, recognizing the understanding in her words. She wasn't just talking about Rebel. After Melissa departed with promises to return for a formal evaluation the following week, James and Amy began the slow process of helping the new horses settle in. They worked in tandem, Amy preparing medications, while James created individual care plans based on his experience with Ghost and Willow. "We need to establish a routine immediately," he explained as they worked. "Traumatized horses need predictability. Same feeding times, same people, same procedures every day." Amy nodded. "Consistency builds security, like with PTSD patients." James didn't acknowledge the parallel directly, but he appreciated her matter-of-fact approach to both his military background and his personal struggles. As evening approached, they finished administering Ember's first round of antibiotics, a challenging process that had required patience and ingenuity to accomplish without triggering the mare's panic response. "You're good at this," James commented as they cleaned up. "Most vets I've met would have insisted on restraints regardless of the psychological impact," Amy shrugged. "Most veterinary programs still prioritize efficiency over emotional well-being, but the research is clear. Trauma-informed approaches lead to better long-term outcomes." They fell into companionable silence as they completed their tasks, moving around each other with an ease that surprised James. He was accustomed to solitude, to carefully guarded personal space. Yet working alongside Amy felt natural, unforced. As darkness fell, they made one final check on all 5 horses. Ghost and Willow had remained agitated throughout the day, clearly aware of the newcomers despite being unable to see them directly. The new arrivals had settled somewhat, though Rebel continued his restless pacing, stopping only to stare intently in the direction of the main corral where Ghost and Willow were housed. "He senses another stallion," Amy observed. "That's going to be our biggest challenge, managing the interaction between him and Ghost once they're aware of each other." James nodded grimly. "Ghost has established this as his territory. Rebel's young and looking to prove himself." "Nature versus rehabilitation," Amy mused. "How do you balance respecting their natural behaviors while helping them overcome trauma?" It was a question James had wrestled with continuously. "We don't suppress their nature. We channel it, redirect it into healthier expressions." They lingered at the fence, watching as Rebel finally stopped pacing and lowered his head to drink from the water trough. The simple act, accepting sustenance in a strange place, represented a tiny victory. "Small steps," Amy said softly, echoing James's thoughts. He nodded. "Always small steps." Later that night, James sat alone on his porch, listening to the occasional nickering from the corrals, the horses communicating in ways humans could only partially understand. The day's events had left him drained but focused. The arrival of the new horses brought fresh challenges but also validation. The program was growing, becoming something that might outlast his individual efforts. His solitude was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Amy emerged from the shadows carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might still be up," she said, offering him one. James accepted it with a nod of thanks. Checking on Ember again at midnight. Her breathing was still labored at the last check. "I set an alarm too," Amy admitted, settling onto the step beside him. "Great minds." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and listening to the night sounds. The horses, the distant coyotes, the whisper of wind through sagebrush. "Rebel reminds me of you," Amy said eventually. James raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "The wariness, the defiance, the way he's constantly assessing for threats." She glanced at him. "The unwillingness to show vulnerability." James stared into his coffee, uncomfortable with her perception but unable to deny its accuracy. Military training. Hard to unlearn. I don't imagine it's just the training, Amy said quietly. War changes people. The horses aren't the only ones healing here. James didn't respond immediately. Few people in his life had addressed his own trauma so directly, without awkwardness or pity. Rehabilitation goes both ways, he finally acknowledged. They help me as much as I help them. Amy nodded, her gaze returning to the night sky. That's what makes your approach unique. It's not about control or dominance. It's about connection, mutual healing. As if in response to her words, a soft nickering came from the main corral. Ghost or Willow? Impossible to tell which in the darkness. A moment later, an answering call came from the temporary holding area. The new horses and the original pair reaching out to each other across the distance that separated them. Dawn broke with an unexpected sound, the sharp, challenging neigh of a stallion, followed immediately by an answering call. James bolted upright in bed, instantly alert. He'd fallen asleep in his clothes after checking on Ember at midnight, and now he grabbed his boots and hurried outside without bothering to lace them. The source of the commotion was immediately apparent. Rebel had somehow worked loose a section of fencing between his holding area and the adjacent empty corral. He hadn't escaped entirely, but now stood at the edge of his expanded territory, head high, repeatedly issuing the distinctive stallion challenge that had awakened James. Ghost, in the main corral, still separated by a considerable distance, stood rigid with attention, his white coat gleaming in the early light as he answered each call with equal fervor. Amy emerged from the small cabin James had prepared for her, medical bag already in hand. What happened? Rebels testing boundaries, literally and figuratively, James replied, assessing the damage. He's smarter than I gave him credit for. Worked that loose board free without injuring himself. Ghost heard him, Amy observed, watching the white stallion pace along his own fence line. They all did, James noted, gesturing toward the mares. Willow had positioned herself closer to Ghost than usual, while Sage and Ember stood alert in their respective sections, attuned to the masculine posturing. After ensuring Rebel couldn't push his advantage further, James and Amy conducted their morning health checks. Ember's breathing had improved slightly, the antibiotics beginning to take effect, but Rebel's agitation had reopened one of his flank wounds. He'll need that cleaned and rebandaged, Amy said, preparing a sedative, and we need to repair that fence before he does more damage, to it or himself. James nodded, watching as Rebel continued to pace, stopping periodically to issue another challenge toward Ghost. This was inevitable. We just didn't expect it so soon. Stallions establishing hierarchy. That, and all of them figuring out where they stand now. 5 horses, 5 different traumas, 5 different healing journeys, and now they're becoming a herd, whether we planned it or not. The morning unfolded in a controlled chaos of veterinary care and fence repair. By midday, the immediate crises were managed, but James knew they'd only addressed symptoms of a larger challenge. We need to rethink our integration timeline, he told Amy as they shared a quick lunch. Keeping them completely separated isn't working. They need visual contact at least to start establishing relationships safely. Amy considered this. The traditional approach would be to keep them isolated until each has fully accepted human handling. That's the problem with traditional approaches, James replied. They ignore herd dynamics. Horses are social animals. Isolation adds another layer of trauma. So what do you propose? James outlined his plan, a series of adjoining corrals with sight lines between them, allowing the horses to see and communicate with each other while maintaining safe separation. Physical introductions would happen gradually, starting with the mares, who presented less risk of aggressive confrontation. Ghost and Rebel will be the last to have physical contact, he concluded. They need time to establish boundaries from a safe distance first. Amy nodded thoughtfully. It mirrors human trauma recovery in some ways, controlled exposure, building tolerance gradually. As they implemented the revised setup over the next few days, James observed the horses' reactions with careful attention. Willow, who had made the most progress in her rehabilitation, showed the least distress at the newcomers. She often stood near the fence line that offered the best view of Sage, the two mares regarding each other with cautious curiosity. Ghost maintained his vigilance, particularly toward Rebel, but the constant challenging had subsided to occasional reminders. A sharp neigh at dawn and dusk, assertions of territory rather than immediate threats. Ember, still weakened by her respiratory infection, seemed to take comfort in the presence of other horses, even at a distance. Her breathing continued to improve, and she began showing interest in her surroundings beyond mere survival concerns. It was Rebel who presented the greatest challenge. His anger hadn't diminished, only focused more specifically on Ghost as the established male. Yet James noticed something interesting. Rebel's aggression lessened during the quiet evenings when James would sit near his corral, not attempting interaction, just being present. "He's starting to associate you with safety," Amy observed one evening as they watched Rebel accept a bucket of feed from James's hands, a small breakthrough after days of leaving food and retreating. "Not safety exactly," James replied. "Consistency, maybe. He knows I'm not going to demand anything from him yet. That's the core of your approach, isn't it? You give them space to heal at their own pace." James nodded. "Most training methods impose human timelines, but trauma doesn't heal on a schedule." As he spoke, James became aware of Melissa approaching, her expression serious. She'd been visiting more frequently since the new horses arrived, documenting the expanded program for the BLM. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "There's a situation developing with the water rights case." James tensed. "What kind of situation?" "Bill Rawlins has escalated. He's filed a formal complaint with the state water engineer's office, claiming your rehabilitation program is putting excessive demand on regional water resources." "That's absurd," Amy interjected. "Our conservation measures exceed standard requirements. We're using less water than a typical ranch this size." Melissa nodded grimly. "It's not about facts, it's about pressure. Rawlins has connections, and he's using them. There's going to be a state-level hearing next month." James absorbed this news in silence. The progress they'd made with the horses suddenly felt fragile, threatened by human politics and greed. "What does this mean for the program, he finally asked. "For now, nothing changes. The BLM fully supports what you're doing here." "But," Melissa hesitated, "if the ruling goes against you, there could be restrictions placed on water usage that would make expansion difficult." After Melissa left, James stood at the fence watching the horses in the fading light. Each one represented a different stage of healing, from Willow's remarkable progress to Rebel's defiant struggle against his own fear. "We'll figure it out," Amy said quietly, coming to stand beside him, "one battle at a time." James nodded, though the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just about Ghost and Willow anymore. The program was growing, becoming something larger than himself, a model that could potentially change how wild horses were rehabilitated across the West. "Sometimes I wonder if I've taken on too much," he admitted, the confession surprising even himself. "Started something I can't finish." Amy was silent for a moment. Then she said, "When I was in vet school, my professor said something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes you go backward before you go forward. But if you're patient enough, persistent enough, eventually you see the miracle.'" She gestured toward the corrals where 5 once broken horses now stood beneath the emerging stars. "This is the miracle, James. Not just their healing, but yours. Worth fighting for, don't you think?" In the distance, Ghost nickered softly, the sound carrying clearly in the still evening air. A moment later, to James's surprise, Rebel answered. Not with a challenge this time, but with a similar soft call. Communication, not confrontation. A small step forward. As always, small steps. As the days passed, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Construction of the expanded facilities continued, though at a more measured pace to minimize stress on the horses. The temporary sightline fencing James had designed was working, allowing the horses to observe each other while maintaining safe separation. Each day brought small but significant changes in their behavior. James documented everything meticulously, building a record that would serve both the BLM study and their defense against Rawlins's water rights challenge. Amy's medical expertise proved invaluable, especially with Ember, whose respiratory infection was slowly but steadily improving under her care. One morning, 3 weeks after the new horse's arrival, James woke to find Sheriff Ellis Parker's vehicle parked outside. "Morning, James," Ellis greeted him, hat in hand. "Sorry to come by so early, thought you should know. There's talk in town about Rawlins hiring outside help for the water rights case, bringing in a big legal team from Reno." James frowned. "He's that determined? This land's been a thorn in his side for decades. Your grandfather refused to sell, and now you're turning it into something that threatens Rawlins's whole worldview." Ellis shook his head. "Man like that doesn't take well to being challenged." After the sheriff departed, James shared the news with Amy as they completed morning checks on the horses. "Legal teams cost money," she noted. "Is it really worth that much to him? It's not about the land itself anymore. It's about winning." James watched as Ghost approached the fence line separating him from Willow, who had been moved to an adjacent corral as part of their integration plan. Some men can't stand the idea of losing a fight, even one they started for no good reason. Amy studied him. "Sounds like you've encountered the type before." "In the military, in life." James shrugged. "Ego makes people dangerous, makes them willing to destroy things rather than see someone else succeed where they couldn't." Later that afternoon, as James was working with Sage on basic halter acceptance, Amy approached with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking about our water situation," she said. "What if we could prove definitively that our usage isn't just conservative, but actually beneficial to the watershed?" James raised an eyebrow. "How would we do that?" "Environmental impact study. Scientific data rather than just testimony. I have a friend from vet school who specializes in agricultural water systems. She could help us document exactly how our management practices are affecting the water table and downstream flow." The idea had merit. James had been approaching the dispute as a legal battle to be endured, but Amy's suggestion offered an opportunity to change the narrative completely. "Would your friend be willing to come out here?" he asked. Amy nodded. "She owes me a favor, and honestly, she'd probably be fascinated by what we're doing with the horses. The ecological impact of different grazing and water management approaches is her specialty." That evening, as James made his final rounds, he paused at Rebel's corral. The young stallion had been the slowest to show progress, his anger and defiance a shield against vulnerability. Yet tonight, something was different. Instead of pacing or challenging Ghost with aggressive calls, Rebel stood quietly watching as James approached. For the first time, the horse didn't retreat to the far corner or pin his ears back in warning. He simply waited, his intelligent eyes assessing James with wary curiosity rather than hostility. "Making progress, aren't you?" James said softly, carefully extending his hand to the fence line. Rebel stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he caught James's scent. After a moment's hesitation, the stallion moved forward, stopping just short of touching James's hand. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that perhaps not all humans brought pain and fear. James remained still, allowing Rebel to set the pace. Finally, in a gesture that sent an unexpected wave of emotion through James, the horse briefly touched his muzzle to James's palm before retreating to a comfortable distance. "Small steps," James murmured. "Always small steps." He was still standing there when Amy found him minutes later. "Everything okay?" she asked. James nodded, not quite trusting his voice. "Rebel just made contact, voluntary contact." Amy's face lit up with understanding. "That's huge." "Yeah," James cleared his throat. "Sometimes the angriest ones are carrying the deepest wounds. They fight the hardest against help because they've learned that vulnerability leads to more pain." Amy was silent for a moment. Then, with characteristic directness, she asked, "Are we still talking about Rebel?" James didn't answer immediately. The parallel wasn't lost on him. His own resistance to connection, to accepting help, mirrored in the defiant stallion. "Both, I guess," he finally admitted. "Took me a long time to understand that not everyone who offers help has an agenda, that sometimes people just care." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Amy didn't press or offer platitudes. She simply nodded, respecting both his insight and his discomfort with vulnerability. "My friend can be here next week," she said, changing the subject. "She'll need about 3 days to conduct the initial assessment." James nodded gratefully. "That timing works. The state hearing is still 5 weeks out." The following week brought Dr. Elena Vasquez, Amy's colleague, to the ranch. She arrived with equipment for water quality testing, soil analysis, and topographic mapping. James had expected a typical academic, detached and theoretical, but Elena proved to be practical and hands-on, immediately grasping the implications of their water management system. "Most ranchers allow unrestricted access to water sources," she explained as they walked the property boundaries. "The cattle trample vegetation, erode banks, and contaminate the water. Your controlled access points and rotational grazing actually improve water retention in the soil." She spent 3 days meticulously documenting the ranch's water cycle, from rainfall catchment systems to the natural filtering effect of strategic vegetation James had planted along the creek banks. "This is impressive," she told him on her final evening. "You've created a sustainable water management model that could be replicated across similar properties in the region." "Will it be enough to counter Rawlins's claims?" Amy asked. Elena nodded confidently. "My report will show that your operations not only use less water than his cattle ranch, but actually improve water quality downstream, which directly benefits his property." He's essentially fighting against his own interests. As they discussed next steps, James's attention was drawn to movement in the corrals. Following the carefully planned integration schedule, today marked the first day Ghost and Willow had been placed together since the new horses arrived. Both had shown enough progress in their individual rehabilitation that James felt confident they could support each other without becoming overly defensive. Now, in the evening light, the 2 white horses stood close together, Willow's head resting against Ghost's neck in a posture of complete trust and companionship. After weeks of separation, they had reunited as if no time had passed, their bond unbroken. "Look at that," Amy said softly, following James's gaze. "After everything they've been through, they still find their way back to each other." James nodded, watching the 2 horses who had changed his life. "That's how you know it's real. True connections survive the hard parts." The words applied equally to the horses and to his own journey, the connections he'd severed after returning from war, and the new ones he was slowly, cautiously beginning to form. With the horses, with Amy, with himself. The morning of the state water hearing dawned clear and crisp. James adjusted his tie, borrowed from Sheriff Ellis, as he studied his reflection in the small bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him was changed from the one that had first found Ghost and Willow months ago. Still weathered, still bearing the invisible scars of war, but somehow more present, more alive. "You clean up nice," Amy commented as he emerged from the bathroom. She wore a simple blue dress that transformed her from the practical veterinarian he'd grown accustomed to into someone who could confidently navigate courtrooms and government buildings. "Been a while since I wore anything but work clothes," James admitted, uncomfortable in the formal attire but understanding its necessity. Today wasn't just about him and Rollins. It was about the future of the rehabilitation program and the horses who depended on it. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a stone building that had stood since Nevada's early statehood. James, Amy, and Elena entered to find Melissa already waiting, accompanied by a BLM attorney. Across the aisle, Bill Rollins sat with his legal team, 3 suits from Reno who exuded expensive confidence. "Remember," Melissa whispered as they took their seats, "stick to the facts. Elena's report is our strongest evidence." James nodded, his gaze meeting Rollins's across the room. The older man's expression was a mixture of smugness and determination, a man accustomed to getting his way, especially against opponents with fewer resources. The hearing proceeded with formal precision. Rollins's attorneys presented their case first, arguing that the horse rehabilitation program represented an excessive and inappropriate use of limited water resources in a drought-prone region. They displayed charts showing projected water usage as the program expanded, suggesting it would inevitably impact neighboring properties. When it was their turn, Elena took the stand first, methodically dismantling Rollins's claims with scientific data. Her presentation included soil samples, water quality tests, and comparative analysis of James's water management system versus traditional ranching practices. In conclusion, she stated firmly, not only does the Callaway Rehabilitation Program use approximately 40% less water per acre than the adjacent Rollins cattle operation, but the controlled access points and vegetation management actually improve water quality downstream. Mr. Rollins's property directly benefits from these conservation measures. James testified next, explaining the program's purpose and future plans. He spoke with quiet conviction about the rehabilitation techniques they were developing, approaches that could potentially transform wild horse management across the West. "These horses aren't just animals we're saving," he concluded, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking. "They represent a new way forward, a balance between preserving their wild nature and helping them overcome trauma caused by human intervention." As the hearing adjourned for the panel to deliberate, James stepped outside for air. The courthouse steps offered a view of the distant mountains, the same range where he'd first found Ghost and Willow. How far they'd all come since that day. "Quite a speech in there," came Rollins's voice from behind him. The rancher approached, hands in his pockets. "Didn't figure you for the eloquent type." James turned, studying the man who'd been his adversary these past months. "Just speaking the truth as I see it." Rollins nodded slowly. "Truth's a funny thing. Changes depending on where you're standing." He gazed out at the mountains. "I've worked that land for 50 years, seen folks come with big ideas, new methods. Most don't last." "I'm not going anywhere," James said quietly. "No, I don't suppose you are." Rollins sighed. "Your grandfather was just as stubborn." They stood in silence for a moment before Rollins spoke again. "Those white horses of yours, saw them when I drove past last week. They something special?" James was surprised by the question. "They all are in their own way. But Ghost and Willow, they saved me as much as I saved them." Something shifted in Rollins's expression, not quite understanding, but perhaps a grudging respect. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the courthouse. The panel returned with their decision within the hour. In measured legal language, they dismissed Rawlins's complaint, citing Elena's scientific evidence as compelling and conclusive. Furthermore, they recommended James's water conservation methods as a model for drought-prone regions, suggesting they be studied for potential implementation across similar operations. As they left the courthouse, Melissa was jubilant. "This is better than we hoped for. The endorsement of your methods will make it much easier to secure continued funding." James felt relief wash over him, but his mind was already returning to the ranch, to the 5 horses waiting there. Legal victories meant little to them. They measured progress in trust earned and fear overcome. When they arrived home, Sarah was waiting with unexpected news. "Rebel jumped the fence," she announced as they pulled up. James tensed immediately. "Is he hurt? Did he attack the others?" Sarah shook her head. "That's the thing. He didn't escape. He jumped from his corral into Ghost's." "What?" James and Amy exchanged alarmed glances as they hurried toward the corrals. What they found left them standing in stunned silence. Ghost and Rebel were not fighting or posturing as expected. Instead, they stood side by side at the water trough, drinking peacefully. Nearby, Willow grazed unperturbed by the new arrangement. "I don't understand," James murmured. "Stallions don't share territory like this, especially not after the way they've been challenging each other." Sarah shrugged. "I've been here all day. When Rebel jumped over, I was ready to intervene, but Ghost just accepted him. They sniffed each other, did some minor posturing, and then settled down like this. It's unprecedented in my experience." As they watched, Rebel moved away from the trough, giving Ghost space, a gesture of deference from the younger stallion. Ghost acknowledged this with a gentle nod before approaching Willow, creating a perfect tableau of the unlikely family they had become. "They've created their own hierarchy," Amy observed. "Their own version of what a herd should be." James nodded slowly. "They're adapting, finding a new way to be together that honors their nature but transcends their trauma." In the days that followed, this unexpected harmony extended to the other horses. Under James and Amy's watchful guidance, Sage and Ember were gradually integrated into the newly formed herd. There were moments of tension, of course. Establishing a social order always involved some conflict, but the foundation laid by Ghost and Rebel's surprising alliance created a stability none of them had anticipated. 6 months after James had first rescued Ghost and Willow, the BLM organized an official evaluation of the program. Representatives from wild horse advocacy groups, veterinary schools, and government agencies gathered to observe what had been accomplished. Standing beside Amy as they presented their findings, James watched the 5 horses moving freely in the expanded main corral, no longer separated by fences or fear. Ghost and Willow still shared their special bond, but now it existed within the larger context of the herd. Rebel had found his place as Ghost's lieutenant, while Sage and Ember had formed their own supportive alliance. "What happens next?" a BLM official asked after the presentation. "Will these horses eventually be released back into the wild?" James considered the question carefully. "Some of them, perhaps. Willow's leg has healed remarkably well, but she'll always have limitations. The same with Ember's respiratory system. They might be better suited to life here, where they can receive ongoing care." "And the program itself?" James glanced at Amy, who nodded encouragement. "We're just getting started. The methods we've developed here can be applied to hundreds of traumatized wild horses throughout the West. With continued support, we plan to expand, not just rehabilitating more horses, but training others in these techniques." As the visitors departed, James remained at the fence, watching his horses, for they were his now, in all the ways that mattered, as they moved together in the golden afternoon light. Amy joined him, her shoulder touching his companionably. "They look happy," she said simply. "They are," James agreed. They found their way home. So had he.